The gavel had barely struck the podium before Hazel Grayson pushed her way through the crowd at the back of the field, and what came out of her mouth next would change the fate of every family standing on that sun-baked patch of New Mexico Territory dirt. It was the autumn of 1879, and the land auction outside the town of Cimarron had drawn more than 50 people from a 50-mile radius. Ranchers in their Sunday boots, speculators with ink-stained fingers, and a handful of nervous homesteaders who had scraped together every coin they owned stood shoulder to shoulder in the golden morning light. The Rocky Mountains rose up purple and enormous to the west, and the smell of sage and dry earth hung over everything like the memory of rain that hadn't come in 2 months. Hazel stood at the back of it all in a dress that had been washed so many times the navy blue had faded to the color of a late evening sky. She was 31 years old, lean and sun-darkened from 3 years of working a small farm alone, and her dark copper-streaked hair was pinned back severely under a wide-brimmed hat that had once belonged to her husband, Thomas. Thomas had been dead for 14 months. A fever had taken him quickly, the way a summer storm takes a tree that looked perfectly healthy the day before. He had left her the 120 acres, a barn with a sagging roof, 2 mules named Daisy and Pepper, and a debt to the Cimarron Land and Cattle Company that she had not been able to pay off. The debt was the reason she was standing at this auction now, watching men bid on parcels of land that sat directly adjacent to hers, because whoever purchased those parcels would control the water rights to Crow Creek, the only reliable source of water within 3 miles of her property. Without it, her land was worth nothing. Without it, she was worth nothing, at least according to the logic of the territory. The auctioneer was a round man named Franklin Dodd, who wore a striped vest and spoke with the practiced cheerfulness of someone who had made a career out of other people's misfortune. He stood on a wooden platform that had been hauled out to the field on a wagon, and behind him, a hand-painted sign read, CIMARRON Land Auction, Territory of New Mexico, October 14, 1879. Lot 7, Franklin Dodd called out, mopping sweat from his forehead with a folded handkerchief. 80 acres running from the North Fork of Crow Creek down to the old territorial road. Beautiful water access, gentlemen, beautiful. The bidding started at $200 and climbed quickly. Hazel watched the numbers rise and felt her stomach drop with each increment. She had $47 in a cloth envelope tucked inside her coat. She knew before she arrived that she could not win a bidding war. That was not why she had come. The man doing most of the bidding was Gerald Crane, and just the sight of him made Hazel's jaw tighten. Crane was the primary agent of the Cimarron Land and Cattle Company, a large eastern syndicate that had been buying up parcels throughout the territory for the past 3 years. He was tall, silver-haired, and impeccably dressed in a black suit, and he bid with the lazy confidence of a man who had never once doubted that he would get what he wanted. He was the one who held her husband's debt. He was the one who had sent a letter 2 weeks ago informing her that if she could not repay the full amount of $410 within 60 days, the company would pursue legal attachment of her remaining property. Standing just a few feet to Crane's left was a man Hazel did not recognize. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar of his worn canvas coat. He was somewhere around 33 or 34 by her estimation, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same limestone that made up the bluffs along the creek. He stood with a quietness that was different from the quietness of disinterest. It was the quietness of a man who was paying very close attention to everything while appearing to pay attention to nothing. He held a battered leather notebook and a stub of pencil, and occasionally he would write something down. A surveyor, she thought at first. Or a lawyer. Then she noticed that despite his plain coat and scuffed boots, the notebook had gold lettering on the cover, and the horse tied to the fence post behind him was a magnificent blue roan that had not come cheap. Sold to Mr. Gerald Crane for $480, Franklin Dodd announced, and a murmur went through the crowd. Hazel felt the cold settle over her like a wet blanket. With that parcel, Crane controlled the upper reach of Crow Creek. If he got Lot 8 as well, the lower reach, she was finished. Franklin Dodd called for Lot 8. Gerald Crane opened the bidding at $300, a number designed to discourage competition before it started. Two men made tentative counters and then fell back. The quiet man with the notebook made no bid at all. He was watching Crane with the focused attention of a hawk watching a field mouse. Hazel pressed forward through the crowd, past shoulders and elbows and the smell of tobacco and horse sweat, until she reached the front edge of the gathered people. Franklin Dodd had just called for final bids when she raised her voice. "I have something to say about Lot 8. A silence spread outward from her like a stone dropped in still water. Franklin Dodd blinked and squinted at her from the platform. "Ma'am, bidding is in progress." "Then I am bidding," Hazel said clearly. $47. Someone laughed. Someone else shushed the first person. Gerald Crane turned and looked at her, and a smile touched the corner of his mouth that was not a kind smile at all. It was the smile of a man acknowledging a minor nuisance. "Ma'am," Franklin Dodd said, with the tone a man uses with someone he considers to have lost their mind, "the current bid is $340. "I know what the current bid is," Hazel said. "I also know that Lot 8 has a legal encumbrance on the eastern boundary line that was never cleared in the Territorial Recorder's office when the Simpson estate was dissolved in 1876. The Cimarron Land and Cattle Company knows it too. That is why Mr. Crane is trying to close this purchase quickly and quietly before anyone examines the title chain." The silence that followed was of a different quality entirely. Gerald Crane's smile disappeared. Franklin Dodd's hand, still raised with the gavel, went very still. "The Simpson encumbrance," Hazel continued, "affects 11 acres along the eastern edge of Lot 8. Which means that whoever purchases this lot today will find themselves in a title dispute that could tie up their water access rights in territorial court for 3 to 5 years. I know this because my husband was a surveyor, and he documented the boundary irregularity himself in the summer of 1876. I have his notes. I have his survey maps, and I am prepared to file a formal challenge at the Territorial Recorder's office in Santa Fe before the week is out." She took a breath. Her heart was hammering behind her ribs, but her voice had not shaken, not once. Franklin Dodd turned to confer in a low, urgent voice with his clerk. Two of the other bidders were already drifting away from the front. Gerald Crane took a step toward Hazel, and his voice came out very quietly, the kind of quiet that was designed to be threatening. "Mrs. Grayson," he said, "you are making a significant error." "I am standing on land I have a right to stand on," she said, "speaking words I have a right to speak. If the title is clear, a challenge will fail. You have nothing to fear." She met his eyes and did not look away. It cost her more than she would ever admit, but she did not look away. It was at this precise moment that the quiet man with the leather notebook stepped forward. "I will withdraw my interest in Lot 8, he said, in a voice that was low and even and carried the same quality as distant thunder, "pending examination of the title issue Mrs. Grayson has raised. I suggest the auction be paused until the recorder's records are properly reviewed." Everyone turned to look at him. Gerald Crane looked at him with an expression that suggested he was recalculating something rapidly. Franklin Dodd cleared his throat. "And you are, sir?" "Oscar Townsend," the man said. "I represent the Townsend Grazing Association out of Taos. We have a legal interest in the water rights associated with Lot 8. If there is a title complication, my association will want that resolved before any sale proceeds." Dodd looked between Crane and the man called Oscar Townsend, and made the kind of decision that men in his position always make when two forces of equal and uncertain power face each other. He postponed the auction of Lot 8 pending title review. It was not a victory, but it was not a defeat either, and it was the first time Hazel Grayson had breathed freely in 14 months. She was walking back toward her wagon when she heard boots in the dry grass behind her. "Mrs. Grayson," she turned. Oscar Townsend was walking toward her with his notebook under his arm and his blue roan's reins in his hand. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a very dark shade of brown, nearly black in the midday light, and that there was an old scar along his left jawline that had healed cleanly but had not disappeared. "Mr. Townsend," she said, "that was a brave thing you did up there." "It was a necessary thing," she said. He studied her for a moment with an expression that was not dismissive and not pitying, which already put him ahead of most men she had spoken to in the past year. "Do you actually have the survey maps, your husband's notes?" "I have them." "Have you shown them to anyone, a lawyer?" "I cannot afford a lawyer," she said plainly. He nodded as if this was information he had expected. "There is a man in Cimarron, Thomas Briggs, who handles territorial property law. He owes me a favor. I could ask him to look at what you have." Hazel looked at him carefully. In her experience, men who offered things without naming a price were either genuinely good or building toward a larger ask. She had grown very good in the 14 months since Thomas died at distinguishing between the two. Something about this man's directness, the way he asked questions instead of making assumptions, made her lean toward the former. But she had not survived 3 years of running a farm alone by trusting too quickly. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Because Crane's company has been swallowing up water rights in this county for 2 years, Oscar said. "And I have my own reasons for not wanting him to finish the job. Our interests overlap, Mrs. Grayson, that is all. And if our interests stop overlapping—" He looked at her with something that was almost amusement but not quite. "Then we will have accomplished different things, but at least we will have accomplished something." She considered this for a long moment, with the autumn wind pulling a strand of copper hair across her cheek and the distant sound of Franklin Dodd calling the next lot number drifting over from the crowd. "All right," she said. "Come by my property tomorrow morning. I will show you the maps." The road to Hazel's farm was rutted and dry, cutting northeast from Cimarron through a stretch of juniper and pinon, before it opened onto her 120 acres. The house was a solid adobe structure that Thomas had built in their first year on the land, with a wood-framed porch and 2 chimneys, and a kitchen garden along the south wall that Hazel had kept producing through sheer stubbornness. The barn needed work. The fence on the west side had been repaired 3 times with different materials and showed it. But the land itself was beautiful in the way that northeastern New Mexico is beautiful in October, when the cottonwoods along Crow Creek turn gold, and the sky is that particular shade of blue that looks like it goes on forever. Oscar arrived at 8 in the morning on his blue roan, accompanied by a man she assumed was Thomas Briggs, shorter than Oscar, with wire-rimmed spectacles and an ink stain on his right cuff that suggested he had come directly from his desk. Hazel served them coffee on the porch and spread Thomas's survey maps on the outdoor table. She had spent the evening before going through her late husband's survey case, a leather cylinder that she had not opened since shortly after his death, and the act of unrolling his precise, careful drawings had undone her more than she had expected. Thomas had had beautiful handwriting. He had dated every notation. It was like reading a conversation with a man who was no longer there to answer. Thomas Briggs put on his spectacles and bent over the maps for a long time without speaking. Oscar stood to the side, his coffee cup in his hand, and watched the lawyer work. He did not make small talk. He did not fill the silence with reassurances or questions. He simply waited, and Hazel found herself grateful for that in a way she had not expected. "The Simpson encumbrance is real," Briggs said finally, tapping a notation in the corner of the second map. "Your husband marked it here." A right of passage easement granted to Abraham Simpson in 1869, never formally extinguished when the Simpson family sold and relocated in 1876. If it was not discharged at the recorder's office, it runs with the land. "Can it be used to challenge Crane's purchase of Lot 7? Hazel asked. Briggs looked up at her over his spectacles. Lot 7 does not carry the encumbrance, only Lot 8. But the encumbrance on Lot 8 is sufficient to cloud the water rights for both parcels if argued correctly, because the access route crosses the creek boundary between them. He paused. It would require a formal filing and likely a hearing in Santa Fe. It would take time and some money. But it is a real argument. Hazel said nothing for a moment. How much money? Filing fees and my time, Briggs said, glancing at Oscar, would normally run to about $60, but I believe the fee for this particular case has been adjusted. Oscar, who had said nothing, did not look up from his coffee. We discussed it, he said simply. $60 adjusted to what? Hazel asked, directing the question at Oscar, because she was not a woman who allowed men to negotiate about her without including her. Oscar looked at her directly. To nothing, for now. When the water rights case is resolved, if we succeed, I would ask that your property be included in a shared grazing agreement with my association for 3 seasons, at market rates, which would generate income for you, not cost you anything. Hazel studied him. You are putting up legal costs in exchange for a future grazing agreement you may never receive. I am. That is not a particularly sound financial investment, Mr. Townsend. No, he agreed, and this time there was definitely something close to a smile, though it arrived slowly, as if it wasn't used to being rushed. But Crane's company is not only a problem for you. If he controls both parcels and the full run of Crow Creek, every small operator within 15 miles will be at his mercy within 2 years. I have grazing contracts across 4 counties that depend on open water access. Helping you helps me. I meant what I said yesterday about overlapping interests. Hazel looked at the maps on the table. She looked at the lawyer. She looked at Oscar Townsend, who was standing in the October morning light with a patient stillness that reminded her, incongruously and painfully, of a man standing at the edge of something very wide and very deep and choosing not to step back. File the challenge, she said. Thomas Briggs began making notes immediately. Over the following 3 weeks, Hazel saw Oscar Townsend more often than she would have predicted, and more often, she noticed with some internal discomfort, than was strictly necessary for the legal case. He had a legitimate reason to stop by twice, to collect additional survey notes, and to bring her a copy of the filing documents for her records. But he appeared a 3rd time with no stated purpose other than to repair the broken section of her west fence, which he accomplished without asking permission, working alongside her hired hand, a young man named Pete Reyes, who was 17 and more enthusiastic than skilled with a fence post digger. She watched from the kitchen window for longer than she intended. Oscar was direct with Pete but not unkind. He explained things once and did not repeat himself, and when Pete made a mistake driving a post crookedly, Oscar pulled it out and demonstrated the correct technique without comment or condescension. Pete, who was inclined to be defensive with most adults, seemed to respond to this with something approaching admiration. When the fence was done, Oscar came to the porch and washed his hands at the basin she kept there. She brought him coffee without being asked because it seemed the natural thing to do. You did not have to do that, she said. The fence was going to fall in another week, he said. Pete noticed it too, but he did not have the right posts. I was going to get to it. I know, Oscar said, and he said it without any suggestion that he doubted her, which was so unusual that she did not know how to respond for a moment. They sat on the porch steps with their coffee, and the silence between them had the quality of something that was comfortable without yet being familiar. It was the silence of 2 people who were still measuring each other, but who had both already concluded that the measuring was worth doing. How long have you been running the Grazing Association? She asked. 4 years, he said. My father built it up from a single herd over 20 years. He died in 1875 and left it to me and my brother Daniel. Daniel has no interest in cattle. He is a school teacher in Albuquerque, so it fell to me. You did not resent that. He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. Some days, he said. In the beginning. but I have come to understand that there are worse things to inherit than work you love." She looked out over the golden cottonwoods along the creek. Thomas used to say that about the surveying, that even on the hard days, he would rather be outside with his instruments than anywhere else on earth. It was the first time she had said Thomas's name in front of Oscar, and she noticed the way she had said it simply as a fact, without the familiar constriction in her chest that usually accompanied it. Not that the grief was gone. It was simply that it had reorganized itself into something she could carry instead of something that carried her. "He sounds like a man who knew his own mind," Oscar said. "He did," Hazel said. "He was a good man." A pause. The creek water moved over stones somewhere below them, not visible but audible in the still afternoon. "How did you learn to do what you did at the auction?" Oscar asked. "That kind of argument on your feet in front of a crowd." "Most people freeze." Hazel wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I had nothing to lose," she said. "When you have nothing to lose, the fear changes shape. It does not go away, but it stops being the largest thing in the room." Oscar was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have been dealing with Crane and his company for 18 months. I have filed 2 separate complaints with the Territorial Land Commissioner. I have written letters to the Santa Fe newspaper. Nothing has moved it the way you moved it in 30 seconds at that auction. Because you were fighting from a position of having something," Hazel said. "Your association, your contracts, your reputation. When a person with something to lose challenges a man like Crane, he calculates the cost and applies pressure accordingly. But when a woman in a faded dress with $47 steps forward and says she will drag his paperwork into territorial court, he cannot calculate the cost. He does not have a number for that." Oscar looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. It was not admiration exactly, though there was something of that in it. It was more like recognition. The look of a person who has encountered a specific kind of intelligence they were not expecting and are adjusting to accommodate it. "You should run for the Territorial Assembly," he said. She laughed. It came out more freely than she expected, and the sound of it surprised her slightly. "They do not seat women in the Territorial Assembly, Mr. Townsend." "Not yet," he said, and he said it with such straightforward certainty that she looked at him to see if he was joking. He was not. The legal case ground forward through November with the sluggish, circular pace of territorial law. Thomas Briggs had filed the challenge in Santa Fe and received confirmation that a hearing would be scheduled for the following spring. Gerald Crane's attorneys had responded, as expected, with a lengthy counterfiling arguing that the Simpson encumbrance had been informally extinguished by the terms of the 1876 sale. Briggs was confident this argument would fail but not dismissive of the work required to defeat it. In the meantime, Crane made his displeasure known through smaller channels. A delivery of feed grain that Hazel had ordered from the Cimarron General Store was delayed without explanation and arrived half-spoiled. 2 of her fence posts along the southern boundary were pulled up one night and thrown into the creek. Nothing that could be directly attributed, nothing that rose to the level of legal action. The small, grinding pressure of a man who was accustomed to wearing people down. She told Oscar about it when he came by in mid-November with a progress report from Briggs. He listened without interrupting, and she watched his jaw tighten slowly as she spoke. "I will have someone keep an eye on the southern boundary at night," he said when she finished. "I do not need a guard," she said. "Not a guard," he said. "A hand. I have 2 men who winter pasture their cattle near your south line anyway. I will ask them to camp closer than usual. They will not be on your land, they will just be nearby." She could feel the line between accepting necessary help and surrendering necessary independence, and she walked it with the careful attention of a woman who had learned how much depended on it. "All right," she said, "but I want to know who they are." He told her their names. Brothers named Caleb and Roy Marsh, experienced hands who had worked for his association for 3 years. She filed the information away carefully. She did not take people on faith, not anymore. But she also did not refuse help when it was offered clearly and without conditions. It was during that same visit that the first true shift happened between them, though neither of them acknowledged it directly. Oscar had been preparing to leave and had gone to the fence post where his roan was tied. The horse had worked a shoe loose during the ride over, and Oscar had crouched down to examine the hoof, and Hazel had come down from the porch because she had a farrier's rasp in the barn, and it seemed foolish for him to ride all the way back to Cimarron on a loose shoe when she could tighten it. They worked on the hoof together, Oscar holding the horse steady while Hazel rasped and reset the clinch nails she had found in the small kit Thomas had kept for exactly this purpose. The blue roan, whose name she now knew was Cody, stood with remarkable patience throughout this operation, though he turned his great head occasionally to blow warm air at Oscar's ear in what appeared to be a commentary. "He does that when he is being difficult," Oscar said, which turned out to be a horse joke, and Hazel laughed again. The second time she had laughed in his presence. When she handed the rasp back and straightened up, they were standing closer than they had been before, because the work had required it, and the afternoon light was going soft and amber in the way it does in the high desert in November, turning everything it touched slightly golden. Oscar was looking at her, and there was something in his expression that was different from the careful measuring of their earlier conversations, something that had moved beyond calculation into something quieter and more uncertain. She recognized it because she felt a version of it herself, and recognizing it frightened her considerably more than Gerald Crane had. She stepped back. Not obviously, not dramatically, but enough. "Thank you for bringing the update from Briggs," she said. "Of course," he said, his voice returning to its usual steadiness. He led Cody toward the road. Then, without turning back, "Hazel." It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed, and she was certain he knew she noticed. "The Grazing Association is hosting a dinner in Cimarron on the 22nd for the member families. It is not a formal occasion, just supper at the Halliday Inn. I would be glad if you would come." She considered saying that she would think about it. She considered saying she had too much to do. Both of these things were somewhat true, but she had promised herself after Thomas died that she would not use caution as a permanent substitute for living. "I will be there," she said. The dinner at the Halliday Inn was exactly what Oscar had described. Not formal, but warm in the way that gatherings of working people in hard country tend to be warm, with good food and practical talk and children running between the tables until they were collected and settled. Hazel arrived knowing no one except Oscar and spent the first 15 minutes with the careful alertness of a person in new social territory. What she had not anticipated was that Oscar's association included two other women who managed their own operations. A widow named Margaret Cole, who ran a sheep operation north of town with her adult son, and a woman named Clara Espinoza, who had inherited her late father's grazing permits and had been fighting for 2 years to have them honored under her name rather than reassigned to a male relative. Clara was 28, fiercely intelligent, and had an opinion about everything, most of which Hazel found herself agreeing with. Margaret was 53 and had the kind of practical authority that comes from having solved every possible problem at least twice. Between them, Hazel was sitting at the table eating roasted lamb and discovering that she had been lonely in a specific way she had not allowed herself to fully name. She had been lonely for the company of women who understood what it meant to work and to fight and to keep going. She had not realized how much she had missed it. Oscar moved through the room with a quiet ease, speaking to each table, knowing the names of children, remembering details from previous conversations. He was not performing warmth. He simply had it. She watched this without meaning to and caught Margaret Cole watching her watch him with the shrewd, amused eyes of a woman who has seen this particular moment before. Hazel turned back to her plate with composure she hoped looked entirely natural. Later, after supper, when the children had been carried sleeping to wagons and the conversation had quieted to small groups around the fire, Oscar came and sat beside her. Not adjacent the way people sit when they are being polite, but beside her in the more deliberate way of a person who has chosen their location. Clara tells me you know how to read a land survey, he said. My husband taught me, Hazel said. He said it was practical. She wants to know if you would look at her father's original grazing permit documents. She thinks there may be an irregularity in how they were transferred in the territorial records when he died, something her current lawyer has not caught. Hazel looked at Clara Espinosa across the room, who was in animated conversation with two men and appeared entirely unaware of being discussed. Whenever suits you, Oscar said. She turned back to him. I am not a lawyer. No, he said, but you found something at that auction that a room full of lawyers and surveyors had missed. Or rather, that a room full of lawyers and surveyors had been paid not to notice. She let that settle. Then, I will look at her documents, he nodded. A comfortable quiet settled between them again, and through it ran a faint thread of awareness that had not been there at the beginning of the evening, or perhaps had been there from the beginning and was simply less deniable now. Why are you not married? She asked. She had not planned to ask it and was mildly surprised to hear herself do so. He looked at her steadily, as if the directness of the question was a thing he respected rather than a thing he was put off by. I was engaged, he said. In 1874, her name was Eleanor. She died of diphtheria in the winter of that year. I am sorry, Hazel said, and meant it in the direct, uncomplicated way of someone who understood loss without needing to dress it up. After that, he said, it seemed less urgent to find the right person and more important not to find the wrong one, so I waited. Have you been waiting 5 years? Yes, he said. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. They both understood what was in the space around that single word. Hazel rode home under a sky full of stars that were very close and very bright in the cold November air, and for the first time in a very long time, she was aware of the future as something that might contain things she had not yet imagined, not only things she was bracing against. December arrived with a cold front that pushed down from the mountains and turned the creek into a skin of ice by morning. Hazel doubled her efforts on the farm, winterizing the barn, laying in wood, checking the root cellar. Pete Reyes came 3 days a week and was becoming genuinely useful. The Marsh brothers had been true to Oscar's word, camping at the south boundary without intruding, and after the fence posts were thrown into the creek, there had been no further incidents. Oscar came by on the second Saturday of December with a written summary from Thomas Briggs outlining their strongest arguments for the spring hearing. He stayed for the midday meal because she asked and he accepted, and the meal, which was beef stew and cornbread, felt entirely natural, which was itself slightly unnatural in that it had happened so quickly. After they ate, he helped her carry wood in from the stack against the barn wall. Not because she asked, but because the wood needed carrying and he was there, which was the same logic she applied to fixing his horse's shoe, and in that unspoken symmetry was something she found herself appreciating deeply. When the wood was stacked and she had made more coffee, they sat at the kitchen table with the survey map spread between them, and Oscar asked questions about the Simpson encumbrance that were intelligent and specific, and she answered them. And somewhere in the middle of explaining the boundary of the easement she looked up and found that he was watching her face rather than the map, and that there was an expression on his face that was entirely unguarded. She did not look away this time. Oscar, she said, and saying his given name was both easier and harder than she had thought it would be. Yes, he said, he was entirely still. I need to say something to you directly because I think you are a man who prefers directness. I am, he said. I am aware of what is happening between us, she said. I do not know what to do with it yet. Thomas has been gone 14 months. Some days that feels like a very short time, and some days it feels like another life. I am not a woman who makes decisions carelessly. I am not going to pretend I feel something I do not feel, and I am not going to perform more certainty than I have. He was quiet for a moment. The fire in the iron stove ticked and settled. That is fair, he said, more than fair. I want you to know, she said carefully, that I am not indifferent to you. I want to be honest about that too. He breathed out slowly. I am not going anywhere, he said. I have waited 5 years for something that made sense. I can wait a little longer." "I did not say I needed you to wait," she said. "I said I was not sure yet." He looked at her and the quiet smile arrived again, the slow one that had to find its way through careful habits. "I know the difference," he said. She believed him. Christmas came quietly. Hazel spent it with Pete Reyes's family, the Reyeses, who had 3 younger children and a grandmother who made tamales and spoke mostly in Spanish that Hazel followed imperfectly but warmly. She gave Pete a good pair of work gloves and the grandmother a jar of her apple preserve. She came home in the early evening to a house that was warm from the stove she had banked before leaving and found on her porch a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a new rasp, better quality than Thomas's old one, and a note in Oscar's handwriting that said, "For the farrier who helped Cody, Merry Christmas, O.T." She stood on the porch in the cold, starry evening and held the rasp and the note, and what she felt was not the raw, hollow grief of the past 14 months but something gentler and more complicated, and she acknowledged privately something that had been coming for some time. She wrote him a note in return and asked Pete to deliver it the next morning. It said, "Thank you. Cody has good taste in farriers. Happy Christmas." HG. When she sealed the envelope, she sat for a while at the kitchen table in the lamplight, and she thought about Thomas, and she thought about what it meant to love a person truly, and to lose them and to continue on. She thought about whether continuing on required forgetting, or whether it might be possible to carry the past gently without it becoming a cage. She thought Thomas would have liked Oscar, the steadiness of him, the practical intelligence, the fact that he fixed fences without making a performance of generosity. She thought Thomas would have told her not to be an idiot. She smiled at the wall. January brought new complications. Gerald Crane, apparently having learned of the legal filing, made a direct approach to Hazel's outstanding debt. His agent appeared at her door on a Tuesday morning, a young man named Fletcher in a city suit who looked deeply uncomfortable being 40 miles from town in January, and presented a formal document offering to purchase her property outright at what Fletcher described as a fair market valuation. The number was $800. Hazel studied the document for long enough that Fletcher cleared his throat twice. "Tell Mr. Crane," she said, handing the document back, "that I am not selling. Not at this price and not at any other. And tell him that if he sends anyone to my door again outside of a formal legal process, I will be writing a very detailed letter to the Santa Fe Daily New Mexican about the company's land acquisition practices in Colfax County, and I have names and dates and figures that will make interesting reading." Fletcher left. Hazel went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and permitted herself approximately 2 minutes of shaking before she made coffee and got on with her day. She wrote to Oscar that evening, informing him of Crane's offer. He arrived the following morning with Thomas Briggs by his side, and by the time the 3 of them were done at the kitchen table, they had added the visit and its implications to the body of material Briggs was assembling for the spring hearing. Briggs observed that a direct purchase offer, while not illegal, complicated Crane's legal position if it could be shown that he was aware of the title irregularity when he made the offer. He would not have offered to buy if he did not need the title cleaned, Briggs said with the satisfied air of a man watching the pieces arrange themselves. After Briggs rode back to Cimarron, Oscar remained, not for any stated reason. He made himself useful, helping Hazel move a section of hay bales in the barn before the cold front that was coming. They worked for an hour in the dusty golden light of the barn, and Hazel was aware in the most ordinary and grounded way that she had not felt accompanied in a very long time, not supervised, not managed, not protected from above, accompanied, alongside. When they finished and stood in the barn doorway watching the flat gray sky press down toward the mountains, she said, without quite planning it, "Would you like to come for supper on Sunday?" He turned to look at her, and in his expression was a careful and genuine happiness that he was not trying to conceal. "Yes," he said. "I would." The Sunday suppers became a quiet ritual through January and into February, alternating between her farm and the small house Oscar kept at the edge of Cimarron. She discovered that he cooked reasonably well, and that he owned more books than she had expected, and that he read them, which was evidenced by the notes in the margins in the same careful hand as his letters. She discovered that he had strong opinions about territorial water law and almost no opinions about current fashion, which struck her as an admirably consistent set of priorities. He discovered that she played the fiddle not brilliantly but with real feeling, and the first time she played in his presence on a Sunday evening in February with snow tapping softly at the window, he sat quietly through 3 songs and then said, "That was your husband's, wasn't it?" indicating the instrument. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said. "He played better than I do, but he said I had better feeling for it." "He was right," Oscar said. She put the fiddle down and looked at him across the table. The candle between them made shadows move slowly on his face. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About what I said in December, about not being sure yet." He was very still, not the stillness of anxiety but the stillness of a man paying precise attention. "I am more sure," she said. The fire in the stove was the only sound for a moment. "Hazel," he said, and in the way he said it was everything that had been building for 4 months, all the careful steadiness and the patient distances and the work done side by side, compressed into a single word spoken in a voice that had lost its usual evenness. "I know it is too soon by some people's reckoning," she said. "I know some people will say I have not mourned properly. I know what I am risking." "What are you risking?" he asked very quietly. "The same thing everyone risks," she said. "Loving someone and losing them." "Yes," he said. "I have already done it once," she said. "I know what it costs. I am choosing to risk it anyway, because the alternative is to stop choosing at all, and Thomas would have hated that." Oscar stood up from his chair and came around the table and took her hand, and the touch of his hand was warm and careful and certain all at once. He did not kiss her that evening. He simply held her hand and looked at her with a directness that contained everything she needed to see. "I will not waste it," he said, "whatever time we have." "No," she agreed. "Neither will I." The spring hearing in Santa Fe was set for April 8th. Thomas Briggs, Hazel, and Oscar rode the 90 miles together over 2 days, arriving on the 6th and spending 2 days in review before the hearing. The territorial courthouse was a long, low building off the plaza, and the hearing room smelled of old paper and lamp oil, and the particular institutional gravity of a place where decisions got made. Gerald Crane arrived with 2 attorneys from Denver, which was either a sign of confidence or a sign of concern, and Hazel spent the entirety of the night before the hearing deciding that it was the latter. She was called to speak in the 3rd hour of proceedings, to testify about the survey documents and her late husband's methodology. She spoke clearly and without hesitation, translating the technical language of surveying into the plain terms that the presiding commissioner, a careful older man named Judge Elias Hartley, could follow without a background in land measurement. She answered the opposing attorneys' questions without being flustered by their formality or their implied suggestion that she was not qualified to speak. Afterward, standing in the corridor while the commissioner deliberated, Oscar stood beside her and did not say anything for a while. Then, "You were remarkable in there." "I was frightened the entire time," she said. "I know," he said. "You were remarkable in there." She leaned her shoulder against the wall and tipped her head back and looked at the plaster ceiling of the territorial courthouse corridor, and felt the strange suspended quality of a moment in which everything has been done that can be done, and the result has not yet arrived. His hand found hers beside her against the wall, not clasping, just present, just there. Commissioner Hartley's ruling came at 4 in the afternoon. The Simpson encumbrance, he found, had not been formally discharged from the territorial records. The sale of Lot 8 to the Cimarron Land and Cattle Company was suspended pending clear title. All water rights associated with Lot 8 remained with the original territory grant until title was cleared, which under the circumstances would require a new filing and a minimum 6-month review period. Furthermore, since the water access rights on Lot 7 were legally dependent on the Lot 8 title chain, the company's ability to restrict water access to adjacent properties along Crow Creek was similarly suspended. Crane's attorneys protested. Judge Hartley heard them out with the patience of a man who is already certain of his answer and confirmed his ruling. Outside on the courthouse steps in the April sunshine with the mountains blue and enormous to the north, Hazel stood and let the feeling wash over her. Not triumph exactly, something more sober and more durable. Relief. The particular relief of a battle that was not about winning but about not losing, and of having held the line long enough for the truth to be heard. Thomas Briggs was writing notes rapidly. Oscar was shaking his hand and then turning to her. She took his face in both her hands and kissed him on the steps of the territorial courthouse in Santa Fe, with the whole spring spread out around them, and he kissed her back with the full weight of a man who has been patient for a very long time and is now absolutely certain where he stands. Thomas Briggs, still writing notes, cleared his throat with the air of someone who is professionally obliged to notice nothing. They rode back to Cimarron on the 9th and 10th of April, and the ride was different from the ride out. Not different in circumstances. The same road, the same camps, the same high desert landscape opening around them, but different in the quality of silence between them, which had moved from the carefully maintained distance of two people being appropriate to the naturally comfortable quiet of two people who have crossed into something new. On the second evening, camping near the Rayado River with a fire built up against the cold, Oscar told her about his father, a taciturn Scottish immigrant named William Townsend, who had arrived in New Mexico in 1849 with $17 and a head full of ideas about open land, and who had built his grazing operation acre by acre over 30 years without once admitting that he did not know what he was doing. He had died of a stroke at 58, in the middle of a sentence about the spring calving schedule, which his sons and the two hands who were present had all agreed was exactly how he would have wanted it. Hazel told him about growing up in Missouri, her father's small farm, the schooling she had received from a teacher who had believed emphatically that girls should read everything and understand mathematics, because the world would try to take advantage of them if they did not. She told him about meeting Thomas at a surveyor's office in Springfield where she had been working as a copyist, and how he had asked her opinion on a map she was copying, and then had been so surprised by her answer that he had dropped his pencil. She told this story with affection and without pain for the first time, and that itself felt like something important. In the firelight, with the river moving in the dark behind them, Oscar reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that was precisely calibrated to the moment, and she turned her face toward his hand briefly and then looked at him with complete honesty. "I love you," she said. It came out simply, without drama, because it was simply true. He was quiet for a moment, not from uncertainty. From the kind of care that people who have been very careful with words reserve for the most important ones. "I love you, Hazel," he said. "I have for some time." "How long?" she asked, with something she recognized as purely curious and slightly delighted. "Since you stood up at that auction with $47 and turned the entire thing around," he said. That was the exact moment. She laughed, and the sound of it went out into the dark and the river sound, and the stars over the Rayado were very bright, and she was aware, all the way through, that she was happy. They returned to Cimarron on April 10th, and over the following weeks the practical business of two lives that had been running separately began, carefully and thoughtfully, to converge. There were conversations about the debt to Crane's company, which had not disappeared in the legal ruling, but had lost much of its leverage now that the water rights were protected. Oscar proposed a simple solution. The grazing agreement he had originally offered would generate enough income within a single season to clear the debt entirely, and he had the financial flexibility to advance the amount now and be repaid when the season concluded. Hazel refused the advance, not out of stubbornness, but out of a clear-eyed understanding of what financial dependence could do to even the best relationship. She went instead to Margaret Cole, who had been watching the whole situation with the shrewd attention of a woman who knew a good investment when she saw one, and they arranged a short-term loan between themselves at a modest rate that Hazel calculated she could repay in 4 months. She paid Gerald Crane's company the $410 in full, in coin and certified bank draft, on a Wednesday morning in May, and she watched the company's agent rights settled in the ledger book with a satisfaction so complete she could feel it in her back teeth. Then she went home and plowed the north field and got the summer garden in, because life continued to require ordinary acts regardless of what else was happening in it. Oscar proposed on a Saturday evening in June, on the porch of her farmhouse, with the creek below them gold in the late light and the cottonwoods fully leafed out, and the smell of the summer grass coming up warm from the fields. He did it without a speech. He said, "I want to build something with you, Hazel, a real life here together. Will you marry me?" She had not been waiting for it, or had perhaps been waiting for it for months without acknowledging it. She looked at him for a moment with all the things she knew about him: his steadiness, his intelligence, his patience, the way he treated Pete Ray's and the way he spoke about his dead father, and the way he had stood beside her on the courthouse steps and not said "I told you so" at any point in the entire preceding 6 months when he would have been justified in saying it many times. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." They were married in August of 1880 at the small church in Cimarron, by a minister named Reverend Calloway, who had an impressive beard and a tendency toward lengthy benedictions, which Oscar bore with the philosophical patience that Hazel was coming to understand was one of the deep signatures of his character. The wedding was attended by Thomas Briggs and his wife, the Cole family, Clara Espinoza and her brother, Pete Ray's and his grandmother, the Marsh brothers, and a substantial portion of the Townsend Grazing Association's member families, who had all adopted a certain proprietary interest in the relationship that Hazel found both amusing and unexpectedly touching. She wore a dress of deep green wool that Clara Espinoza had helped her choose in Santa Fe during a trip in July, and she carried a small bunch of wild asters from along Crow Creek, because wild flowers from her own land seemed exactly right. Oscar wore his best coat and a tie that he had clearly not worn recently and which had been pressed with some effort, and when she came down the church aisle and he looked at her with the unguarded expression she had first seen in her kitchen in December, and which she had never grown tired of seeing. Reverend Calloway's benediction did run long, but the moment he said, "I now pronounce you man and wife," and Oscar took her face in his hands with the same careful certainty he had shown on the courthouse steps, and kissed her with the whole congregation watching, she was very aware that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The first year of their marriage was not without difficulty. No first year in a frontier territory in 1880 was without difficulty. The legal case with Crane's company was still working through its final stages in Santa Fe, requiring 2 additional trips and several exchanges of formal correspondence. The barn roof finally surrendered to its own structural despair and had to be replaced over the course of one very committed week in September, with Oscar, Pete, Caleb Marsh, and 3 additional hands from the association working alongside Hazel and Clara, who had taken to arriving at moments when work was needed with the uncanny timing of a person who maintained a network of informants. Gerald Crane, his legal position weakened significantly by the Lot 8 ruling, sold a portion of his Colfax County holdings to an Eastern buyer and reduced his local operations. He did not leave the territory entirely, and he remained a man Hazel would never turn her back to, but the grinding daily pressure of that first year was gone. The encumbrance case was finally resolved in November 1880, when the territorial recorder formally certified the discharge of the Simpson easement, clearing the Lot 8 title chain in a way that actually reduced the Crane Company's legal interest rather than solidifying it. Due to certain additional irregularities Briggs had identified in the company's original purchase documents. Oscar and Hazel were at the kitchen table together when the letter from Briggs arrived, and after she read it, she set it down and looked at her husband and said, "It is done." He got up and came around the table and held her for a long, quiet moment without saying anything, and she rested her forehead against his jaw and felt the full weight of the past 2 years settle and lift and become simply part of the foundation they were standing on. The grazing agreement Oscar had originally proposed went into formal operation in the spring of 1881, generating exactly the income he had predicted and allowing Hazel to repay Margaret Cole with full interest 2 months early. She and Margaret had by this point developed a friendship that was practical and affectionate in equal measure, and they had begun meeting monthly with Clara Espinoza and 2 other women in the area to discuss land rights, water access, and related issues with an informality that Hazel suspected would eventually formalize into something with a name and a charter. She brought this up to Oscar one evening in April 1881 while they were walking the boundary of the North Field, checking the new fence Pete had put in. He listened to her description of the group's discussions, which had become increasingly substantive, and then said, "You should ask Thomas Briggs to come to the next meeting." "Why?" "Because the 4 of you between you have identified at least 3 legal irregularities in local land records that no one else has caught. If you are going to do this work seriously, you should have a lawyer in the room." She stopped walking and looked at him. "You think we should formalize it?" "I think you have already formed something real," he said. "The question is whether you are going to let it be formal or informal. Informal means you can be ignored. Formal means you have standing." She thought about standing in the back of a field auction with nothing to lose and a voice that had turned everything. She thought about what formal standing might have meant to every woman she had met in the past 2 years who had been managing and fighting and working without it. "You are right," she said. "I often am," he said, with the careful, slow smile, "about certain categories of things." She pushed his shoulder with hers and he caught her hand and they walked the rest of the fence line together in the evening light. In June of 1881, Hazel discovered she was expecting a child. She told Oscar on a Sunday morning, sitting across from him at the breakfast table with the direct simplicity that was characteristic of her in all important moments. He went very still in the same way he went still when he was paying complete attention to something, and then he came around the table and sat beside her and took her hands and looked at her with an expression so full it was nearly impossible to contain. "Are you well?" he asked, because this was Oscar and this was the first question he asked. "Very well," she said. "Strong, the doctor says." "Good," he said, and held her hands very carefully for a long moment. "Good." That summer was the best summer of her life, which she knew even while it was happening, which is rare. The farm was productive. The grazing agreement was in its 2nd successful season. Pete Reyes had hired on full time and was developing into a genuinely skilled hand with both fence and livestock. Oscar's association continued to expand steadily, adding 2 new member families in the autumn, and Oscar managed it with the consistent patient competence that she had come to understand was simply who he was, not a performance but a deep characteristic. Clara Espinoza had finally had her father's grazing permits formally recognized under her own name, after Briggs had filed the correct challenge, and a sympathetic new land commissioner in Santa Fe had reviewed the case. She came to Hazel and Oscar's kitchen table in August to tell them the news, and they celebrated with good coffee and a bottle of wine that Oscar's brother Daniel had sent from Albuquerque. And Clara cried a little and then was immediately embarrassed about it, and they all pretended not to notice, which was the kindest thing to do. Their son was born on December 3, 1881, in the house on Crow Creek, attended by a midwife named Rosa Garza and eventually by Margaret Cole, who had arrived 3 hours in with practical assistance and an absolute refusal to leave regardless of what anyone said. Hazel had thought beforehand about what this moment would feel like. She had thought about it in the way you think about something large and approaching, trying to prepare. But the actual moment, when the baby was placed in her arms in the lamplight with Oscar sitting on the edge of the bed with his hand on her back and his face absolutely overcome, was nothing she could have prepared for. The child was small and red and extremely vocal about his opinions from the first breath, which Oscar said was a quality he must have inherited from his mother. And Hazel, exhausted and euphoric and entirely certain about every choice that had brought her to this moment, laughed until she was crying, which might have been the crying she had needed for some time. They named him Thomas William Townsend. Thomas for Hazel's first husband because he had loved her well and deserved to be remembered, and William for Oscar's father, who had built something from nothing in a hard country with no margin for error. Both names carried weight, and that was exactly right. Margaret Cole, examining the baby with the critical expertise of a woman who had delivered more livestock than she could count and had opinions about comparative robustness, declared him healthy and solid and likely to cause trouble, and offered this assessment as the highest compliment she knew. Little Thomas was, from the beginning, exactly what Margaret had predicted. He was a child of enormous physical energy and complete indifference to schedule, who found everything in the world interesting and communicated this interest at high volume. By the time he was walking, Pete Reyes had taken on a semi-official role as the person who retrieved him from places he was not supposed to be, which included twice from inside the barn's hay bales and once from the lower branch of the large cottonwood by the creek, which he had reached by means that no one who witnessed the aftermath could satisfactorily explain. Oscar was the kind of father Hazel had suspected he would be: present, patient, deeply attentive without being anxious. He taught his son the names of stars and the logic of water flow and the correct way to hold a horse's hoof for examination. He read to him from the books with notes in the margins, explaining the notes when Thomas was old enough to ask about them. He never spoke down to him. Watching them together on the porch in the summer evenings, Thomas in his father's lap and Oscar pointing out something on the far edge of the land, Hazel felt the complete weight of everything she had chosen and everything she had been given, and found it absolutely sufficient. The land rights group that she and Clara and Margaret had started had become, by 1882, a formal organization with a name, the Colfax County Women's Land Rights Association, and a charter filed with the Territorial Recorder's Office by Thomas Briggs, who had developed a personal mission out of the work that he credited entirely to Hazel's original challenge at the auction, and who attended every meeting with the devotion of a convert. The association had, by that point, assisted 4 other women in the county with title irregularities, water rights disputes, and the particular form of bureaucratic erasure that occurred when a woman tried to hold property on her own. Not all of the cases succeeded. Territorial law was imperfect and inconsistently applied, and there were commissioners and judges who had no interest in expanding how they interpreted women's legal standing. But enough succeeded to matter. Enough succeeded to be remembered. Hazel testified twice more in Santa Fe, once in 1882 and once in 1883, in cases arising from the association's work, and she became known to the Territorial Recorder's staff as a woman who understood survey documents at a level that was genuinely uncommon and who was not easily flustered. The commissioner who heard the second case remarked afterward to Thomas Briggs that Mrs. Townsend was wasted in the farm and ought to be reading law. Briggs relayed this to Hazel. Hazel considered it for a week and then sent a letter of inquiry to the only law office in New Mexico that had expressed any openness to the concept of women reading law, a young firm in Santa Fe, and was currently waiting for their response. She told Oscar this over supper, in the same direct way she had told him she loved him, and that she would marry him, and that she was expecting their child. He put down his fork and looked at her. What would it mean in terms of time, he asked. A great deal of correspondence study, she said. Some trips to Santa Fe. Briggs has offered to supervise the reading. It would take 3 years, perhaps 4. He picked his fork back up and resumed eating with the considered thoughtfulness of a man doing genuine calculation. Then, I think you should do it. It will take me away from the farm regularly. We have Pete, Oscar said. We have the association. You will not be leaving anything uncovered. He looked up. And you have been doing the work of a lawyer for 3 years. You might as well have the standing to match. She looked at him across the table. This man she loved for so many reasons that had only multiplied over time, and felt the full warmth of a life that had been built on honest ground. You know, she said, when I stood at the back of that auction with $47 and everything going wrong, I did not imagine any of this. What did you imagine? Oscar asked. I was trying to save my farm, she said. I was not trying to save anything beyond that. I was not thinking about the future. I was thinking about that exact moment and what the moment required. He nodded slowly. And what did it require? The truth, she said. Just the truth. Spoken plainly, by someone with nothing left to protect by staying quiet. Oscar was looking at her with the expression she had first seen in her kitchen a long time ago, the one that was completely unguarded. You did more than save your farm, he said. We did, she said. You were there. I was standing in the crowd, he said. You stepped forward, she said. That was not nothing. He reached across the table and she gave him her hand, and they sat like that in the lamplight with little Thomas asleep in the back room making the small determined sounds that occupied even his sleeping hours, and the creek running over its stones outside, and the mountains somewhere in the dark to the west. In 1883, a daughter was born to them. They named her Eleanor Clara Townsend. Eleanor for the woman Oscar had loved and lost, because Hazel had suggested it and meant it with her whole heart, and Clara for her godmother, who cried again at the christening and was again treated with tactful courtesy by everyone present. Eleanor turned out to be the quiet counterpoint to her brother's perpetual motion. She was a child who observed everything with large, serious, dark eyes and delivered her eventual verdicts in complete sentences, which she produced somewhat late, but thereafter with considerable authority. She and Thomas fought with the focused intensity of people who love each other enormously, which Rosa Garza, who had become something of a family fixture, observed was the mark of children with strong parents. By the time Hazel completed her legal reading in 1886, under Briggs's supervision and through the correspondence program in Santa Fe, she had 2 children, a farm that was genuinely productive, a grazing agreement with the Townsend Association that had been renewed for its 5th season, and a husband who had not once in 6 years made her feel that her ambitions were inconvenient to him. The territory of New Mexico still had 15 years before statehood. Women would not vote in federal elections until 1920. Hazel knew both of these facts with complete clarity and harbored no illusions about how much remained undone. But in Colfax County, 4 women had kept their land who might have lost it. A 5th had had her grazing rights honored. 2 cases of fraudulent title transfer had been documented and challenged. And at least one man, Gerald Crane's former agent Fletcher, who had eventually come to Hazel in some confusion about a title irregularity in his own modest property, had discovered to his private astonishment that the woman he had once delivered an inadequate purchase offer to was now the most knowledgeable person in the county on the subject of territorial land records. She charged him the standard consultation rate. He paid without complaint. Oscar, who had been told this story over supper, laughed for a full minute, which was rare enough to be memorable. Thomas was 4 years old by this point, and Alina was just past 2, and the farm on Crow Creek in the October of 1885 was a different place from the one Hazel had stood on alone in the winter of 1879. Not bigger, but denser, lived in, built up in the way that homes become homes through accumulated presence. The porch Thomas had built at the front of the house had been extended to run the full length of the south wall, because Oscar had added on to it the first summer they were married, and every year something small had been added until it had become the kind of porch that invites people to stay. The barn had a solid new roof. The garden along the south wall was 3 times the size it had been. The cottonwoods along Crow Creek were taller. On a Saturday in October of 1885, which was a blue and golden day with the aspens on the mountains just beginning to turn, and the smell of the high country coming down on the wind, Hazel and Oscar sat on the extended porch, while Thomas conducted an elaborate investigation of something in the creek bank below, and Alina sat between her parents with a rag doll and a focused concentration that suggested she was listening to everything. Pete Ray's 23 now and managing the farm operations with a competence that made Hazel feel both proud and slightly superfluous, had ridden into town for supplies. The Marsh brothers had moved their winter camp back to the south boundary 2 days ago, a reliable indicator that the season was turning. "Do you know what I was thinking about this morning?" Oscar asked. "Tell me," Hazel said. "That auction," he said, 6 years ago. I was standing in that crowd, not knowing anyone and not having a clear plan beyond stopping Crane from getting one more parcel. And I saw this woman in a faded blue dress step to the front of the crowd and say something that stopped everything. I was terrified, Hazel said. "You were magnificent," he said, "and I thought I would very much like to know that woman." "You fixed my fence," she said. "That was your opening move." "It needed fixing," he said with absolute integrity, and she laughed. "It needed fixing," she agreed. Thomas called up from the creek bank that he had found an exceptionally large rock and required witnesses. Oscar called back that he would be right there and stood up and looked down at Hazel with the afternoon light on his face and the mountains behind him and 6 years of a shared life in his eyes. "I will always be glad you spoke up," he said. She looked up at him. "So will I," she said. "I had nothing to lose." "You had everything," he said, and he meant it, and she understood what he meant by it, that the woman standing at the back of the auction field with $47 and a dead husband's hat had been, in every sense that mattered, a woman with everything still ahead of her. She took his hand for a moment. He squeezed it. Then he went down to inspect the important rock, and she heard Thomas's delighted narration of its features begin immediately. And Alina climbed up onto the vacated chair with her rag doll and looked at Hazel with her father's serious dark eyes and said, with the authority of a 2-year-old who has reached a conclusion, "Good." "Yes," Hazel said. "Good." The mountains were going purple in the west, the way they always did at this hour, and the creek was bright below them, and somewhere down the bank her husband was examining a rock with their son with the full genuine attention he gave to everything that mattered. In the morning there would be work, and in the week ahead there would be the next association meeting and the Briggs consultation and the winterizing of the barn, and all the ordinary demanding business of a life, lived fully and without apology in a hard and beautiful country. She sat on the porch her husband had extended and listened to the creek and the voices and the aspens turning on the mountain, and felt the full completed weight of a life that had been reclaimed and rebuilt and made into something she recognized, with absolute certainty, as her own. The sun went down over the Rocky Mountains in a long, slow blaze of orange and red, and the first star appeared over the eastern ridge, and Hazel Townsend, who had once been Hazel Grayson with nothing to lose, sat on her porch and watched the night come in over the land she owned and loved and would never surrender, with the sound of her family rising up into the cooling air, and was complete.